An accident brings a memoryless millionaire to a humble family. A luxury watch sparks questions about his identity. Memory fragments reveal controversial decisions from his past. An unexpected visit uncovers secrets that could change everything. The rain mercilessly battered the dirt road that snaked through the hills of Colorado's countryside. Thunder echoed through the valley as if the sky wanted to split in two, while occasional lightning illuminated the rustic landscape of the region. In a simple yet cozy home, Margaret was brewing coffee in the kitchen, worried about the relentless storm. "Mom, do you think John will make it back with Grandma's medicine?" asked Emily Thompson, her 23-year-old daughter, as she helped organize the family's small pantry. "If it's God's will, my dear. Your brother knows these roads well," Margaret replied, trying to hide her own concern. The sound of rain against the clay roof tiles created an unsettling symphony. On the porch, Anthony, the family patriarch and a man respected in the area for his wisdom and honesty, watched the storm with narrowed eyes. Something troubled him that night, a strange feeling he couldn't explain. His 55 years of life in the countryside had taught him to trust his instincts. It was then that a different noise caught his attention. It wasn't just the sound of rain or thunder, but something metallic, followed by a muffled crash coming from the direction of the dangerous curve known locally as Destiny's Curve. "Emily, call your brother Peter. I think something happened at the curve," Anthony shouted, already grabbing his raincoat and a flashlight. Peter, the eldest son at 28, appeared quickly, already wearing his rubber boots. "Dad, do you think it could be John?" "No, son, your brother wouldn't come from that direction, but whoever it is, they might need help." The two men braved the storm, struggling down the muddy path. The flashlight revealed the treacherous terrain as they approached the source of the noise. What they found left them stunned. A luxury car had skidded on the curve, precariously perched on the edge of a ravine. "There's someone inside," Peter shouted, running toward the vehicle. Through the fogged-up window, they could see an unconscious man. Carefully, they managed to open the door and check his vital signs. The stranger was dressed in fine clothes, now stained with mud, and had some minor injuries on his head. "We need to take him home, Father. We can't leave him here in this storm," said Peter, already preparing to carry the man. Mr. Anthony hesitated for a moment. Helping a stranger always involved risks, but his heart wouldn't allow him to abandon someone in need. "Let's go, son. We'll come back later to see what we can do about the car." Struggling to carry the man along the muddy path, father and son finally arrived home, where they were greeted by Mrs. Margaret and Emily Thompson, who had already prepared the guest room, a small space that was rarely used. "Mercy, who is this man?" asked Margaret, helping to settle the stranger on the bed. "We don't know, Mother. We found him passed out in an imported car at Destiny's Curve," explained Peter, while Emily Thompson brought clean towels and warm water to tend to his wounds. The stranger remained unconscious, but his breathing was steady. His features were refined, and even in his unconscious state, there was something about his posture that suggested a life far removed from the simple existence of this family. In the pocket of his soaked shirt, they found only a silk handkerchief, with the initials GM embroidered in gold. "Look at this, Father," said Emily Thompson, showing a watch she had found on the man's wrist. It was clearly an expensive piece, with a sophisticated design and gold finish. "Keep that safe, daughter. When he wakes up, he'll want it back," replied Anthony, thoughtfully observing the stranger's face. The family took turns throughout the night, monitoring the man's condition. The rain continued outside, but inside the simple home, an atmosphere of mystery and anticipation settled in. Who was this man? Why was he driving alone on that isolated road on a stormy night? In the early hours of the morning, as Emily Thompson kept watch, the stranger began to stir, murmuring incomprehensible words. His eyes slowly opened, revealing a look of complete disorientation. Where am I?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "Oh, you're safe," replied Emily Thompson, trying to calm him. "You were in an accident on the road. My father and brother brought you to our home." The man tried to sit up, bringing his hand to his head with a pained expression. His eyes scanned the simple room, taking in the adobe walls and wooden ceiling. I can't remember. Who am I?" The stranger's question echoed through the small room, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. She called for her parents, who soon appeared, still drowsy but concerned about the condition of the man they had rescued. "So you really don't remember anything?" asked Mr. Anthony, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Not even the accident?" The man furrowed his brow, as if trying to grasp memories lost in a deep, dark well. "It's all confusing. I only have sensations, fragments, nothing concrete." His way of speaking, even in confusion, carried a natural elegance that didn't go unnoticed by the family. Mrs. Margaret, with her maternal intuition, sensed the man's discomfort. "Don't force it, son. Memory is like a frightened bird. The more you chase it, the more it flees. I'll make some chamomile tea to calm your nerves." As the matriarch left the room, John, the youngest son, finally arrived home, soaked and surprised by the unusual activity at that hour. After being quickly briefed on the events, he commented, "Dad, I passed by Destiny's Curve on my way back. The car is pretty damaged, but I managed to get some documents from the glove compartment before the rain ruined everything." The stranger immediately showed interest. "Documents? Maybe they can help figure out who I am." John, however, shook his head. "Unfortunately, I only found some papers from the car, but they're badly water damaged. It's hard to read anything." Emily Thompson, who was watching everything closely, noticed something curious. Even though he had lost his memory, the man maintained certain gestures and manners that seemed deeply ingrained. The way he held the teacup her mother brought, the way he sat on the simple bed, it all suggested someone accustomed to a more refined environment. "You need to rest," said Mrs. Margaret maternally. "Tomorrow we'll think better about what to do. For now, you're safe here." The following hours brought dawn, and with it, new challenges. The stranger, still weak but determined to get up, showed surprising resilience. As he tried to take his first steps, he staggered slightly, being supported by Peter. "Easy, well, what should we call you?" asked Peter, helping him steady himself. Emily Thompson, who was arranging some clean sheets, suggested, "How about Gabriel, because of the initials on the handkerchief, GM." The man considered for a moment, as if testing the name in his mind. "Gabriel. Yes, that could work, at least until we find out my real name." Throughout the day, small details began to catch the family's attention. During breakfast, served at the simple kitchen table, Gabriel automatically reached for a napkin to wipe his lips, a refined gesture that stood out in the humble setting. His hands, though now dirtied by the mud from the accident, showed signs of constant care without the characteristic marks of hard labor. "You must be an important man," commented Mr. Anthony, observing how the guest, even in his confusion, maintained a naturally elegant posture. "Someone must be looking for you." The remark cast a shadow of concern over Gabriel's face. "Perhaps, but why was I alone on that road? Why can't I remember anything?" Emily Thompson, who was feeding the chickens in the yard, caught everyone's attention. "Dad, there's a car coming." It was a simple vehicle driven by Mr. Julian, the owner of the general store in the nearest village. He stepped out of the car with a worried expression, greeting everyone in his characteristic manner. "Anthony, I came as soon as I heard about the accident. People are talking about a luxury car on the road. Do you have any idea what happened?" Before anyone could respond, Julian spotted Gabriel, and his eyes widened slightly. There was something in the merchant's gaze, a flicker of recognition perhaps, that he quickly masked. "This is Gabriel," introduced Mrs. Margaret hesitantly. "He was in an accident and has lost his memory." Julian studied the man for a few moments, his expression unreadable. "No memory, huh? Interesting." His tone carried a nuance that didn't go unnoticed by Peter, who was watching everything closely. The merchant didn't stay long, citing other commitments. Before leaving, however, he cast one last meaningful glance at Gabriel, who was distracted trying to help Emily Thompson with a broken fence, a task in which, curiously, he showed complete unfamiliarity. After Julian's departure, a peculiar silence hung over the property. Mr. Anthony, a man experienced in the ways of rural human relations, felt that the visit had been more than just a neighborly show of concern. There was something in the merchant's eyes, a guarded certainty that left him uneasy. The days that followed brought a peculiar routine to the Oliver farm. Gabriel, still without memory but determined to make himself useful, tried to help. With the daily chores, though his inexperience with rural work was evident, his delicate hands, clearly unaccustomed to hard labor, now bore the first calluses. "No, that's not how you milk a cow," laughed Emily Thompson, watching Gabriel's clumsy attempts with Mimosa, the family's dairy cow. "Look, you have to be more gentle." She stepped closer, demonstrating the correct motion, aware of the proximity between them. Gabriel smiled, a smile that lit up his face and made his green eyes sparkle. "Seems like I was born to be a city man," he remarked, trying again. The comment, though casual, sparked a moment of reflection for both. On the porch, Margaret watched the scene with a mix of concern and tenderness. She noticed the exchanged glances between her daughter and the mysterious guest, and it unsettled her. "Anthony," she called to her husband, who was fixing a tool, "have you noticed how Emily has been acting differently?" Her Anthony looked up from his work. "I have, woman. But what can we do? The heart doesn't choose a time or place to beat. Faster." That afternoon, while everyone worked in the fields, Peter decided to visit the village. Something about Mr. Julian's reaction days ago had bothered him, and he was determined to investigate. At the general store, he found the merchant organizing some goods. "Good afternoon, Mr. Julian," greeted Peter, feigning casualness. "I came to buy some supplies my mother asked for." The merchant seemed slightly nervous upon seeing the young man. Of course. How is your guest doing? Any memories come back?" Peter noticed the poorly disguised anxiety in the man's voice. "Not yet, but you know what's funny? The other day he was reading the old newspaper you left here at the store, and he managed to solve those French crossword puzzles that no one in the area could figure out." The information seemed to agitate Julian even more. "In French? Interesting." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Peter, I need to tell you something. Last week, before the accident, I saw a piece of news in a newspaper from the capital about—" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek car that stopped in front of the store. A tall man, dressed in an impeccable suit despite the heat, stepped out of the vehicle. His piercing gaze swept the surroundings before he entered the shop. "Good afternoon," he said in a deep, polite voice. "I'm looking for information about a friend who might have passed through this area. It's a very important matter." Peter felt a shiver run down his spine. The man took a photograph from his pocket, but before he could show it, Julian quickly intervened. "You know how it is around here, sir. So many people pass through. And with that heavy rain last week, many travelers had to stop." The visitor put the photo away, but his gaze lingered on Peter. "I understand. If you hear anything, here's my card. It's very important to locate this person." After the man left, Peter and Julian exchanged meaningful looks. The shopkeeper seemed even more agitated. "Peter, go home. I need to take care of some things, but I'll stop by early tomorrow to talk to your father. Something serious is going on." On the way back, Peter was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the unusual activity near the farm. As he approached, he saw Emily Thompson and Gabriel sitting by the creek that ran through the property. She taught him how to make straw baskets, a technique passed down through generations in her family. "You know, Gabriel," she said, her skilled hands weaving the straw, "sometimes I think your memory loss might be a second chance, an opportunity to start over, to be whoever you want to be." Gabriel stopped his clumsy work on the basket, gently touching Emily Thompson's hand. "What if I don't like who I was before?" The intimate moment was interrupted by the sound of Peter's approaching footsteps. He cleared his throat, causing the two to quickly separate. "Emily Thompson, I need to speak with you, alone." As Gabriel politely stepped away, Peter shared with his sister the events in the village. Her expression gradually shifted from curiosity to concern. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, glancing in the direction where Gabriel was now unsuccessfully trying to fix a broken fence. "For now, nothing," replied Peter. "But tomorrow, Mr. Julian is coming here, and something tells me we're going to find out a lot more about our mysterious guest." The morning arrived full of anticipation. Mr. Anthony, alerted by Peter about Julian's imminent visit, barely managed to sleep. In the kitchen, Mrs. Margaret prepared a strong coffee, her experienced hands working automatically while her mind wandered over the possible revelations the day might bring. Gabriel, unaware of the stir his presence was causing, had woken up early to help John with the garden. His refined accent contrasted with the rural setting as they discussed planting techniques. "Funny," John commented, watching Gabriel awkwardly handle the hoe. "You're no good at farm work, but the other day I saw you fix Dad's old radio with impressive ease." Gabriel stopped his work, furrowing his brow. "It's like my hands know what to do with certain things, but others—" He looked at the blisters forming on his palms. "Others feel completely foreign." Julian's arrival was announced by the commotion of the farm dogs. He wasn't alone. In his car, an elegant middle-aged lady accompanied him. His face showed a mix of anxiety and anticipation. "Mrs. Margaret—" "Mr. Anthony," greeted Julian, visibly nervous. "This is Mrs. Beatrice. She came from the capital, especially to—" The lady, however, did not wait for the full introduction. Her eyes had found Gabriel, who was returning from the garden with John. She brought her hands to her mouth, her eyes instantly welling up with tears. "Gustav!" she exclaimed, taking a step forward. "My God, it's really you!" Gabriel remained motionless, his face a mask of confusion. There was no recognition in his eyes, only bewilderment at the lady's emotional outburst. "I'm sorry," he said gently, "but I don't remember. Do you know me?" Mrs. Beatrice had to be supported by Julian. Mr. Anthony quickly brought a chair for her to sit while Mrs. Margaret rushed to fetch a glass of water. "I'm your aunt, Gustav. Beatrice Mendelssohn. You are Gustav Mendelssohn, my nephew. When I saw your photo in the newspaper that Julian showed me, I could hardly believe it. The revelations struck like lightning among everyone present. Emily Thompson, who was watching the scene from the porch, felt her heart tighten. Gabriel or Gustav seemed lost, searching his mind for any connection to that name, that woman. "Gustav Mendelssohn," he repeated, as if testing the sound of the name. "Why was I alone on that road?" Mrs. Beatrice hesitated, exchanging a meaningful look with Julian. "It's a complicated story, my dear. You were going to an important meeting when you disappeared. Your company, Mendelssohn Enterprises, is going through a crucial moment." "Company?" interrupted Peter, who had been silently observing everything until then. "You mean he is one of the most influential businessmen in the country," Julian completed. "That's why I was so nervous when I recognized him. The press has been talking a lot about his disappearance." Gabriel, now revealed as Gustav, staggered slightly, being supported by John. The information seemed too much to process. Fragments of memory began to surface: meeting rooms, important documents, people in formal attire. There was an important decision," he murmured, pressing his temples. "Something about a project—" "The new village project," confirmed Mrs. Beatrice. "An urban renewal that would affect thousands of families. You were reluctant to approve it, even under pressure from the board." Emily Thompson, who could no longer just stand by and watch, approached Gabriel and Gustav. "That's why you seemed so troubled in recent days when you started having flashbacks." He looked at her, his eyes revealing a whirlwind of emotions. "I felt there was something important, something that needed to be resolved. But here I learned to see things differently." Mrs. Beatrice observed the exchange of glances between the two with interest. "Gustav, we need you to come back. The company, your life, everything is waiting for you." A heavy silence fell over everyone. Anthony, with his characteristic wisdom, was the first to break it. "Sometimes life takes everything we have to show us what truly matters." At that moment, the sound of an approaching car caught everyone's attention. It was the same elegant vehicle Peter had seen at the warehouse. The man in the suit stepped out, his face showing satisfaction as he saw the group gathered. "Finally, we found you, Mr. Mendelssohn," he said, walking toward the porch. "We have much to discuss about the new village project." The arrival of the man in the suit, who introduced himself as Richard Vasconcelos, a lawyer for Mendelssohn Enterprises, brought an immediate shift in the farm's atmosphere. His polished demeanor barely concealed an urgency that made everyone uncomfortable. "Mr. Mendelssohn," said Richard, deliberately ignoring the familial environment that had formed there. "The board is awaiting your decision on the new village project. Billions in investments depend on your signature." Gustav, still adjusting to his newly discovered identity, felt a familiar pressure in his temples. More memories began to surface. Tense meetings, heated arguments, architectural blueprints spread over marble tables. "The project," he murmured, images forming in his mind. It was going to displace entire families, wasn't it? "To build the largest commercial and residential complex in the country," Richard added, his tone suggesting that the end justified the means. "Thousands of jobs will be created. Progress isn't always convenient for everyone, but it's necessary." Emily Thompson, who had been watching everything with growing concern, couldn't contain her indignation. And where would those families go? People like us who live off the land? The question struck Gustav like a bolt of lightning. He looked at the family that had taken him in, Anthony, Margaret, Peter, John, and Emily Thompson, and saw in them the reflection of all the families that would be affected by his decision. The man he was before the accident might have hesitated to approve the project. Now, after experiencing the simple yet dignified life of the countryside, the idea seemed even more disturbing. "I have an alternative proposal," Beatrice interjected, surprising everyone. "I spent the last few days studying the project. We could resize it, preserve part of the area for family farming, create a municipal market for local products." "Impossible," Richard cut in. "The investors are already impatient. We need Mr. Mendelssohn's signature immediately." At that moment, Mr. Anthony, who had remained silent, rose from his chair on the porch. "Young man," he said, his calm voice carrying the weight of years of wisdom, "sometimes you need to lose your way to find the right path." The farmer's words prompted a moment of reflection for everyone present. Gustav felt something shift within him. It wasn't just memories returning, but a new understanding forming. "Richard," he said, his voice taking on a firm tone that surprised everyone, "I want to see all the project documents, every detail, every implication." "But sir, the—" "Time? Time is exactly what I need right now," Gustav interrupted. "I won't make hasty decisions that affect so many lives." Mrs. Beatrice smiled discreetly, while Richard tried to hide his frustration. Emily Thompson, on the other hand, watched Gustav with a mix of pride and apprehension. The simple man she had known was transforming before her eyes, but his heart remained the same. By late afternoon, after lengthy discussions, Richard left, visibly displeased. Mrs. Beatrice decided to stay in town, lodging at the local inn. Before leaving, she hugged her nephew tightly. "You've always been different from the other executives, Gustav," she whispered. Maybe this accident was a gift from destiny. Alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange, Gustav was surprised by Emily, who approached quietly. "I've never seen anyone stand up to that man like that," she said, sitting beside him. "I've learned a lot here," he replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon, "about real value, about dignity, about—" He hesitated, turning to face her. "About love." Emily Thompson's heart raced, but before she could respond, Peter appeared in a hurry. "You need to see this," he exclaimed, holding a newspaper. "I just picked it up in the village. It's about the new village project, and there's something you urgently need to know." Peter's expression made it clear that the revelations were far from over. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky red, as if announcing that big changes were on the way. The newspaper Peter held trembled in his hands as everyone gathered around the kitchen table. The article took up the entire front page, with a photo of Gustav in executive attire, alongside headlines about the controversial new village project. "Look at this," said Peter, pointing to a specific section. "The project isn't just about a commercial complex. There are studies proving that the region has one of the largest freshwater reserves in the state. The real interest is controlling those resources." Gustav felt a wave of memories hit him. Secret meetings, confidential reports, whispered conversations in corporate hallways. "Now I remember," he murmured, pressing his temples. "That's why I was reluctant. They wanted to privatize the region's water sources. Privatize water, exclaimed Margaret, horrified. But that would affect not only the families in New Village, but all the rural properties in the area. Emily, who was reading the article over her brother's shoulder, frowned. There's more. According to the newspaper, some board members were pushing for a quick vote before this information went public. That's why Richard is so eager for my signature, concluded Gustav, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. They know I discovered the truth about the project before the accident. Anthony, who had been listening in silence, rose from his chair. Son, it's not just about water we're talking about. It's about the lives of hundreds of families who, like us, depend on this land to survive. At that moment, they heard the sound of a car approaching. It was Mrs. Beatrice hurrying back to the farm. Her face showed concern. Gustav, we need to talk, she said, entering the kitchen. I just received some calls. The board has called. An extraordinary meeting for tomorrow. They want to force a decision with or without you. They can't do that, protested Emily Thompson. Gustav is the president of the company. They can if they can prove he's incapacitated, explained Beatrice. Richard didn't come here just to get a signature. He was assessing the situation, looking for evidence of his condition. Gustav stood up, a new determination in his eyes. Then let's go to the capital right now. I can't let them destroy these people's lives. I'm coming with you, declared Emily Thompson, surprising everyone. Daughter, began Mrs. Margaret, but she was interrupted by Mr. Anthony. Let her go, woman. Sometimes the heart knows better than the head what the right path is. As Emily Thompson ran to pack a small bag, Gustav watched the family's movements, with a lump in his throat. In just a few weeks, these simple people had taught him more about dignity and character than years in corporate corridors. Mrs. Margaret, he called, do you remember what you told me on the first day about memory being like a frightened little bird? The matriarch nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Now I understand that some memories needed to be lost, so that I could find something far more valuable. John, who had gone out to check the car, hurried back into the kitchen. More people are arriving. There are 2 company cars. Peter ran to the window. It's Richard, and he's brought more people with him. It must be the board, said Beatrice, worried. They came in person. Gustav felt the weight of the situation on his shoulders. On one side, Richard and the board, representing his past of power and influence. On the other, the Oliver family, and Emily Thompson, who had shown him a new meaning for the word wealth. No matter what happens, he said, holding Emily's hand as she returned with her suitcase, some decisions are priceless. The car headlights illuminated the room through the window, signaling that the moment of confrontation had arrived. The Oliver family stood united, while Gustav prepared to face his past and fight for a future, unlike anything he had ever imagined for himself. Night had fully fallen over the Oliver farm when the executive cars parked in the dirt courtyard. From the first vehicle emerged Richard, accompanied by 3 men in impeccable suits. From the second, a figure appeared that made Mrs. Beatrice hold her breath. Edward Mendelssohn, Gustav's older brother and vice president of the company. Little brother, said Edward, his voice carrying a false cordiality as he approached the porch. What a picturesque place to hide. Gustav, who was watching the group's arrival from the doorway, felt a wave of memories hit him. He recalled the countless arguments with his brother about the direction of the company, the ideological clashes that had always kept them apart. I'm not hiding, Edward, he replied, his voice steady. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing things clearly. Emily remained by Gustav's side, her silent presence offering support. Mr. Anthony and Mrs. Margaret stayed close, while Peter and John positioned themselves strategically at the corners of the porch. Gentlemen, Richard interjected, addressing the other executives, as you can see, Mr. Gustav is different. The mental confusion caused by the accident. I am perfectly lucid, interrupted Gustav, and I know exactly why you're here. The New Village project isn't just about a commercial complex, it's about controlling the region's water reserves. A tense silence fell over the group. Edward adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. Always the idealist in the family, he said. with a forced smile. "But business is business, brother. The board has already decided. We're only here as a courtesy to offer you one last chance to be part of the project." It was then that Mrs. Beatrice stepped forward, her elegant posture contrasting with the rural setting. "Not so fast, Edward. As the majority shareholder, I still have something to say about this." The executives exchanged glances, surprised. Richard quickly consulted some documents in his briefcase. "Mrs. Beatrice," he said nervously, "you can't directly interfere with the board's decisions." "Can't I?" she smiled, pulling an envelope from her bag. "These documents say otherwise. And there's more. We discovered that you hid the environmental reports about the project's impact on local communities." Emily Thompson, who had been watching everything closely, noticed something strange in Edward's behavior. The man seemed increasingly agitated, his restless hands betraying his nervousness. "Gustav," Edward called, changing tactics, "think about the company, about our father's legacy. Are you going to throw it all away because of some farmers?" The word sounded like an insult, making Gustav's blood boil. He looked at the family that had taken him in, simple people who had taught him the true meaning of wealth and dignity. "You know, Edward," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I've spent the last few weeks learning about real value. I saw how Mr. Anthony works from dawn to dusk to support his family with dignity. I learned from Mrs. Margaret that wealth isn't measured in money, but in love and respect. Peter and John showed me what true loyalty is." He paused, his eyes meeting Emily Thompson's before continuing. "And I discovered that there are things no amount of money in the world can buy." "Very touching," Richard mocked, "but we have a company to run. If you're not up to it—" "He is perfectly capable," interrupted a new voice. Everyone turned to see Dr. Silver, the village doctor, climbing the porch steps. "And I have all the reports that prove it." Julian was right behind him, carrying a briefcase. "And I have here copies of all the documents you tried to hide about the project. Interesting how a simple merchant can uncover so much when he pays attention to the right conversations." Edward visibly paled. The other executives began whispering among themselves, clearly worried about the direction things were taking. "Now," said Gustav, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that characterized his position as the company's president, "let's discuss an alternative for the new village project, one that benefits everyone, not just a few investors." The moonlight illuminated the farmhouse porch, witnessing a unique moment where power and simplicity, past and present, clashed in a confrontation that would define not only the future of a company, but the destiny of hundreds of families. The tension on the Oliver family's porch was palpable, as Gustav, now fully aware of his identity and responsibilities, presented his alternative vision for the new village project. "Imagine," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew both the corporate world and the reality of the countryside. "A venture that unites development and sustainability, a complex that preserves aquifer recharge areas and creates a hub for modern family farming." Edward huffed impatiently, but the other executives seemed interested. One of them, the oldest in the group, leaned forward in his chair. "Go on, Gustav," he encouraged. "How exactly would this work?" Emily Thompson, who had spent the last few days helping Gustav develop the new project, unfolded a map of the region they had prepared together on the porch table. "Look," she explained, surprising the executives. With her knowledge, we can divide the area into 3 sectors. The first maintains the commercial complex but resized. The second creates an environmental protection area that preserves the springs. And the third establishes a center for sustainable agricultural development. "This is ridiculous," protested Edward. "The investors would never." "The investors," interrupted Mrs. Beatrice, "have already shown interest in the new proposal. I made sure to present it to some of them this afternoon myself." Richard, who had until then maintained a skeptical expression, began taking notes. As an experienced lawyer, he recognized when the wind was changing direction. "The original project had serious flaws," continued Gustav. "It completely ignored the environmental and social impact. This new model not only preserves natural resources, but also creates more jobs in the long term." Mr. Anthony, who had been silently observing everything, noticed a subtle shift in the executive's demeanor. The initial arrogance was giving way to genuine interest, especially when Gustav began presenting the projected numbers. "An agricultural research center?" questioned one of the executives reviewing the documents. "This could attract international investments." "Exactly," confirmed Gustav. "Moreover, the market for organic and sustainable products is growing. We can be pioneers in a model that others will follow." Edward, seeing his original plan crumble, made one last attempt. "What about the commitments we've already made, the contracts?" "All contracts have renegotiation clauses," interjected Richard, surprising everyone with his change of position. "In fact, from a legal standpoint, the new project poses far fewer risks." The night wore on, and with it, resistance to the new project began to dissolve. The executives, initially skeptical, were now enthusiastically discussing the implementation details. Even Edward, though still reluctant, couldn't deny the solidity of the proposal. Emily Thompson watched Gustav with pride. The man who had arrived confused and without memory at the farm now combined the best of both worlds, the executive competence and the human sensitivity he had developed during his stay with the Oliver family. Mrs. Margaret, discreet as always, served coffee for everyone, including those who hours earlier had treated her with disdain. Her simple gesture of hospitality did not go unnoticed by the executives, who were beginning to understand what Gustav saw in that family. "There's something you all need to understand," said Gustav as the meeting was coming to an end. "What happened to me wasn't just an accident, it was an awakening. I learned that true leadership isn't about imposing power, but about creating opportunities for everyone." Mrs. Beatrice smiled, proud of her nephew. "Your father would be proud, Gustav, not for the empire he built, but for the man you've become." As the executives prepared to leave, now with a new vision for the project and a renewed respect for their president, Gustav pulled Emily Thompson aside to a corner of the porch. "I wouldn't have made it without you," he said, holding her hands. "You taught me to see the world through different eyes." The look they exchanged said more than words. There, under the starry sky of the countryside, not only a new business project was born, but also a love story that defied social barriers. Edward, observing the scene from afar, finally seemed to understand something. He approached his brother before leaving. Maybe you're right, Gustav. Maybe we really do need a change." The night was coming to an end, but it was only the beginning of a new era. At the Oliver farm, where it all began, an unlikely group of people had proven that progress and humanity could and should walk hand in hand. The following weeks brought a remarkable transformation to the region. The Oliver farm became the center of operations for the new project, with a constant flow of technicians, agronomists, and executives. Gustav, now dividing his time between the capital and the countryside, made sure to maintain the simplicity he had learned during his stay with the family. "It's amazing how everything has changed," Emily commented as they walked through the Dio area where the agricultural research center would be built. "Who would have thought that the man lost in the rain would transform so many lives?" Gustav smiled, watching the agronomists enthusiastically discussing sustainable farming techniques with Mr. Anthony. "Actually, it was you all who transformed me. I'm just giving back." The project was progressing faster than expected. The news of an initiative that combined economic development with social responsibility had attracted the attention of the media and international investors. Edward, surprisingly, had become one of the biggest enthusiasts of the new approach. "You know, brother," he said during a visit to the farm, "I always thought you were the dreamer in the family. Now I see that sometimes you have to dream to create something truly meaningful." Margaret, who maintained her routine of taking care of the house and feeding everyone who showed up, was now coordinating a group of women from the region who were developing handmade products to be sold in the future commercial complex. "God writes straight with crooked lines," she philosophized, while teaching her traditional recipes to a renowned chef who planned to open a restaurant focused on regional cuisine. Sometimes you have to get lost to find the right path. Peter and John had become key players in the project. The brothers' practical knowledge of the land and local traditions perfectly complemented the technical expertise of the specialists. Together, they were developing an innovative model of family farming that was beginning to attract attention from other regions. One afternoon, While overseeing the construction of the research center, Gustav received an unexpected visit. Was Richard, the lawyer who had once fiercely opposed his ideas. "I came to make amends," he said, watching the tractors preparing the land. "I spent years thinking that development meant trampling over everything and everyone. You've proven there's another way." Emily Thompson, who actively participated in the project's decisions, had become a natural leader among the region's residents. Her knowledge of the local reality, combined with a progressive vision, made her the perfect bridge between the corporate world and the community. "It's been quite a journey," she said to Gustav, as they shared a moment of tranquility on the farm's porch at the end of a busy day. "Sometimes I wonder if all of this is real." Gustav held her hand, feeling the texture of the calluses formed by farm work. "It's more real than anything I've ever experienced. You know, losing my memory made me find who I was really meant to be." Beatrice, who watched the couple from afar, smiled with satisfaction. As the company's main shareholder, she had bet everything on her nephew's transformation, and now she saw its fruits not only in the positive numbers, but especially in the genuine happiness he displayed. In the makeshift office set up in the old tool room, Anthony reviewed the project's progress reports with Gustav. The farmer, with his simple wisdom, often offered insights that no consultant could see. "Do you regret taking me in that stormy night?" asked Gustav, half jokingly, half seriously. Mr. Anthony adjusted his hat, thoughtful. "Son, there are times when we plant without really knowing what we'll harvest. But when the seed is good, the harvest always surprises." The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. On the farmhouse porch, now a meeting point between two worlds once so distant, Gustav embraced Emily Thompson, breathing in the scent of earth and wildflowers she always carried. "You changed my life," he whispered. "No," she replied, her eyes glistening with the reflection of the sunset. "We changed each other, and together we're changing so much more." Night fell gently, bringing with it the soft breeze of the countryside and the sound of crickets. At the Oliver farm, where a story of transformation had begun, the future was shaping up not as an imposition of progress, but as a harmonious dance between the new and the traditional, between development and preservation, between love and purpose. The first year of the new village project was coming to an end, bringing with it the first harvests and achievements. What was once just a dream was now materializing in hectares of sustainable crops, modern structures that blended with the rural landscape, and most importantly, smiles on the faces of the local residents. Emily Thompson, after months of intense work coordinating the relationship between the community and the company, had become a respected figure, both in the business world and among the farmers. Her ability to navigate between these two worlds caught the attention of an important international sustainable development organization. "They want me to travel across the country implementing similar projects in other regions," she told Gustav. During a walk through the experimental agriculture fields. "It's an incredible opportunity, but you're hesitant," he finished, knowing her well enough to read her expressions. "You're afraid of leaving your family, the project, us." The wind gently swayed the crops around them, creating green waves that stretched to the horizon. Emily stopped, turning to face him. "You taught me that sometimes we need to step out of our comfort zone to grow," she said, her eyes glistening with held-back tears. "But the thought of being away..." Gustav hugged her, breathing in the scent of the sunflowers she loved so much to cultivate. "Who said you have to choose? We can expand the project, create a network of sustainable development. Your experience here is exactly what other communities need." At the family home, Mrs. Margaret was preparing lunch while chatting with Mrs. Beatrice, who had become a constant presence on the farm. The two women, seemingly so different, had developed a deep friendship. "You know, Beatrice," said Mrs. Margaret, seasoning a pot of beans that was already famous in the region, "when that young man arrived here in the rain, all battered and without his memory, I never imagined I was welcoming not just a son but an entire family." Beatrice smiled, helping to peel potatoes, a skill she had recently learned. "And I never imagined I would find a sister wearing a chintz apron," she joked, referencing the transformation in her own life. In the main office of the project, now housed in a beautifully restored mansion in the village, Edward and Gustav were finalizing the expansion plans. The relationship between the brothers had completely transformed over the past year. "Remember when you used to say I was too much of a dreamer?" asked Gustav, showing his brother the impressive financial results from the first year. "And you proved that dreams can be extremely profitable," replied Edward, a genuine smile replacing his old skeptical expression. "But more than that, you taught me that success isn't just measured in numbers." As the afternoon progressed, everyone gathered on the farm's porch for a special celebration. It was the one-year anniversary of the accident that had changed so many lives. Mr. Anthony, standing before everyone, raised a toast. "To life," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "which sometimes takes everything away, only to give us much more than we ever dreamed." Peter and John, now responsible for training other young farmers in the region, shared stories of the transformations they had witnessed. Richard, present at the celebration, couldn't stop marveling at the success of the project he had once tried to stop. As the sun set, Gustav asked for everyone's attention. Hand in hand with Emily Thompson, he had an important announcement to make. "This place has taught me that true wealth isn't stored in vaults, but cultivated in community," he began. "And now we want to share that wealth with other regions of the country," Emily continued. "We're going to expand the project, create a network of sustainable development, and we want all of you to be part of this new phase." The news was met with enthusiasm. Mrs. Margaret couldn't hold back her tears when Emily explained that even while traveling to implement new projects, the farm would always be their home and base. "Love is like that," the matriarch philosophized, embracing her daughter. "The more we share, the more it grows." The night arrived, bringing a gentle breeze and the glow of the stars. On the farmhouse porch, where it had all begun, Gustav and Emily Thompson gazed at the future they had built together. "Do you know what's most incredible?" he said, holding her close. "I had to lose my memory to find my true destiny." Emily smiled, leaning against his chest. "And now?" "Now," Gustav replied, "we'll write our own story. A story of love, purpose, and transformation." In the sky, a shooting star cut through the darkness, as if sealing that moment. At the Oliver farm, where a man without memory had found his way, a new journey was just beginning. The new village project had become a model of sustainable development, attracting visitors from across the country. On a sunny morning, the Oliver farm welcomed an international delegation of business people and environmentalists interested in replicating the initiative in other regions. "It's impressive how you've managed to integrate technology and tradition," commented a French businesswoman, as Emily led the group through the experimental fields. "And it all started with a love story." Emily blushed slightly, but maintained her professional demeanor. Over the past few months, she had become an expert at presenting the project, blending technical data with the human stories that gave soul to the endeavor. "The secret is respecting local knowledge," she explained, pointing to where Mr. Anthony was teaching traditional planting techniques to a group of young farmers. "We didn't come to impose a model, but to create something new together with the community." At the administrative headquarters, housed in a restored mansion that maintained the region's original architecture, Gustav met with Edward and representatives from a social investment fund. His brother, who once prioritized only profits, now passionately advocated for expanding the project to other communities. "The results speak for themselves," Edward argued, presenting charts that showed not only financial returns, but also social development indicators. "We've proven that it's possible to grow while generating value for everyone." Mrs. Margaret, who continued to oversee the experimental kitchen where local products were transformed into gourmet delicacies, welcomed a group of renowned chefs interested in establishing partnerships. "Every spice has its story," she explained, demonstrating how to prepare a special sauce with herbs grown in the region, "and every story has its flavor." By late afternoon, when the visitors had departed, Gustav found Emily in the medicinal herb garden she maintained near the house. It was his private refuge, where he used to organize his thoughts after hectic days. "How was the presentation?" he asked, approaching quietly. "Tiring but rewarding," she replied, picking some mint leaves. They were especially impressed with the environmental education program Peter developed for the local schools. Gustav smiled, proud. The project had grown in ways no one could have predicted, but it maintained its original essence: respect for the land and the people. "I received an interesting proposal today," he commented, sitting on a rustic bench. "They want to create an institute to expand the model to other regions of the country, and they want you to lead the community implementation part." Emily stopped her work with the herbs, turning to face him. "What about the farm, my family?" "The institute would be headquartered right here," he explained. "In fact, your family would be crucial in training the teams that will work elsewhere." At that moment, John came running, interrupting the conversation. "You need to see this. The first class of the agricultural technical course just graduated." At the training center, set up in the renovated old barn, 20 young people from the region received their certificates. Among them was Anna, Mr. Julian's niece, who had become one of the project's biggest enthusiasts. "When I was a child," she said emotionally, "I thought I would have to leave the countryside to have a future. Today I know I can build my future, right here alongside my community." Mrs. Beatrice, who was watching the ceremony next to Mrs. Margaret, discreetly wiped away a tear. "Who would have thought that accident would change so many lives?" "God writes straight with crooked lines," replied Mrs. Margaret, her favorite saying now carrying even more meaning. Night was beginning to fall when Richard arrived at the farm, bringing important news. The lawyer, who had become a key ally of the project, seemed especially excited. "The federal government wants to use New Village as a model for a national sustainable development program," he announced, barely containing his enthusiasm. "They want you to coordinate the implementation in other regions." The news fell like a bomb of joy on everyone. Years ago, when Gustav had arrived lost and without memory at that farm, no one could have imagined that that moment of compassion would lead to such a profound transformation. On the porch of the house, now the favorite spot for family gatherings, everyone came together to celebrate. Peter brought his guitar, and soon the air was filled with songs that spoke of love, land, and hope. Emily Thompson, watching the scene, felt her heart overflow with joy. There were all the people she loved, united by a purpose greater than themselves. Gustav approached, embracing her from behind. "I thought I had lost everything that stormy night," he whispered, "but in truth I was just beginning to find what truly matters." The starry sky of the countryside shone over the Oliver farm, a silent witness to a story that proved the greatest transformations begin with the smallest gestures of love. Spring had arrived in all its glory, turning the Oliver farm into a living painting of colors and scents. The sunflower fields, Emily's idea for organic oil production, created a golden carpet stretching to the horizon. It was Saturday, and the family was preparing for a special event. "I still can't believe we're making it official today," said Mrs. Margaret, adjusting the flowers on the large table set up in the yard for the 10th time. The celebration of Emily and Gustav's engagement had turned into a party for the entire community. "You're more nervous than the couple," joked Peter, who had just arrived with more chairs. The event had grown so much that they had to set up tents to accommodate all the guests. In the room that once housed a memoryless Gustav, now transformed into a cozy office, the businessman adjusted his tie. Edward, who would be his best man, watched his brother with a smile. "You know," Edward began, "our father always said that the greatest wealth lies in people. I never truly understood what he meant, until now." Gustav hugged his brother, moved. The transformation in his relationship with Edward was just one of the many miracles that had happened since that stormy night. In the old barn, now a community center, Emily was getting ready with the help of her friends. The simple yet elegant dress perfectly reflected her personality, a balance between the simplicity of the countryside and the sophistication she had gained through her work on the project. "Daughter," called Mr. Anthony from the door. His voice choked as he saw his girl ready. "It's time." The farmyard was unrecognizable. Handmade lanterns crafted by local artisans hung between the trees. Tables decorated with wildflowers and lace tablecloths made by Mrs. Margaret created a magical atmosphere. People from different worlds mingled naturally. Executives in expensive suits chatted animatedly with farmers, united by the project that had transformed the region. Mrs. Beatrice, elegant in her blue dress, coordinated the final details alongside Mrs. Margaret. The two women, so different in their origins but so alike in their hearts, had become inseparable. "Who would have thought," Beatrice remarked, "that the project which started with so much controversy would turn into all this?" "It's what I always say," replied Mrs. Margaret, her eyes shining. "When you plant love, the harvest can only be good." The ceremony was led by Mr. Julian, now the town's mayor, who had been instrumental in the project's success. His emotional speech spoke of how the love of two people had transformed an entire region. "Today we don't just celebrate a union," he said, "but the living proof that shared dreams can move mountains." When Emily Thompson and Gustav Mendelssohn exchanged their vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the yard. Their words spoke not only of love for each other, but also of a commitment to the community they had helped transform. "You taught me that true wealth isn't measured in numbers," said Gustav, his voice choked, "but in smiles, in hope, in transformed lives. And you showed me that we can dream big without losing our roots," replied Emily, squeezing his hands. "That love can be a force for transformation." The party that followed was a perfect reflection of the fusion of worlds the project had brought about. Traditional regional music blended with modern rhythms. Sophisticated dishes shared space with Mrs. Margaret's homemade treats. Executives shed their jackets to dance foro, while farmers discussed sustainable techniques with environmentalists. John, who had become one of the main instructors at the training center, raised an emotional toast to the lost memory that led us to find a new path. In the middle of the celebration, Gustav and Emily slipped away for a moment to the porch, their special place. From there they could see the illuminated property, the fields they had helped transform, and the people who had become one big family. "You know what's most amazing?" said Emily, leaning against her now husband's chest. "This is just the beginning." Gustav smiled, holding her tighter. "The beginning of many stories. Every new project we implement is a new family that forms, a new hope that is born." The music and laughter reached them, carried by the gentle night breeze. On the porch of the Oliver farm, where it all began, a man who had lost his memory and a woman who had never lost her essence contemplated the future they had built together. "They say some people are born lucky," Gustav reflected. "I had to lose everything to find the greatest luck of all." The full moon illuminated the sky, a silent witness to a story that had begun with an accident and turned into a miracle of love and transformation. At the Oliver farm, where destiny had written its most surprising chapters, a new story was just beginning. 1 year after Gustav and Emily Thompson's wedding, the Oliver farm had transformed into an international reference center for sustainable development. The old mansion, fully restored, now housed the New Village Institute, where delegations from around the world came to learn about the model that had revolutionized the region. "It's incredible how everything has changed," Peter commented to John, as they watched a group of international students learn organic farming techniques from Mr. Anthony. The family patriarch at 60 had become a respected teacher, blending traditional wisdom with modern practices. "Changed while keeping the essence," John replied, waving to Emily Thompson, who was leading a video conference with UN representatives in the office set up in the old barn. His sister, even while now holding a prominent international position, had never lost her simplicity and connection to the land. In the experimental kitchen, which had become a center for culinary research, Mrs. Margaret guided a group of chefs on the use of native ingredients. Her recipes, once known only in the region, were now published in books and specialized magazines. "You never imagined your pastries would end up in Paris, did you, Mom?" Peter teased. "My son," she replied with her characteristic wisdom, "when you do things with love, you never know where they'll end up." Gustav, who divided his time between managing business in the capital and developing new projects on the farm, was especially excited that morning. A new phase of the Institute was about to begin. The mentorship program will allow other communities how to develop their own projects, he explained, during a meeting with Edward and Mrs. Beatrice. "We don't want them to copy our model, but to create their own paths." "Who would have thought," Edward smiled, "that your accident would bring us here? Sometimes I think it wasn't a coincidence that you ended up on this farm." Mrs. Beatrice, who had become a constant presence on the property, agreed. "Some things are bigger than coincidences. They are gifts from destiny." In the medicinal herb garden, now a space for ethnobotanical research, Emily Thompson found a moment of peace amidst the busy day. There, among scents and memories, she often reflected on the extraordinary journey she had lived. "I knew I would find you here," said Gustav, approaching with a smile. "I have a surprise for you." He handed her an envelope, his eyes shining with anticipation. Inside was a letter from the Ministry of the Environment, approving the creation of a nature reserve that would permanently protect the region's water sources. "It was your project that made this happen," he said, embracing her. "Your dream of preserving water for future generations." Emily Thompson felt tears of joy forming in her eyes. "Our dream," she corrected. "This is all our dream." In the afternoon, a new class of young farmers graduated from the training center. Among them was Julian's son, who had decided to follow in his father's footsteps in community leadership. "When I was a child," the young man said in his speech, "I thought success meant leaving the countryside. Today, I know that success is transforming the place where you are." The graduation ceremony brought together people from all social classes, colors, and backgrounds. In the audience, executives from large companies sat alongside family farmers, all united by the same purpose of social transformation. Richard, who had become one of the project's main advocates at the national level, presented the impressive social impact numbers of the Institute. Thousands of families benefited, dozens of communities transformed, and a development model being studied in universities worldwide. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story," he said, moved. "The real revolution happened in people's hearts. At the end of the day, the whole family gathered on the porch, as they always did. The sunset painted the sky with intense colors, as if nature also wanted to celebrate the achievements. I remember it like it was yesterday," said Anthony, "that stormy night when we found a lost man on the road." "And we gained a son," added Margaret, holding her husband's hand. Emily Thompson, nestled in Gustav's arms, watched the scene with her heart overflowing with love. There were all the people who had transformed not only their lives, but those of an entire region. "You know what's most beautiful," she said, turning to Gustav. "How a moment of compassion can change the destiny of so many people." The night fell gently over the Oliver farm, bringing with it the promise of new dreams, new challenges, and new transformations. In the sky, the first stars began to shine, silent witnesses to a story that had begun with an accident and turned into a miracle of love and hope. The morning dawned on the Oliver farm with a special energy. It was the day of the inauguration of the new village cultural center, a space that would bring together the entire history of the region's transformation and serve as an inspiration for future generations. Emily Thompson, with her serene and determined gaze, supervised the final preparations alongside Gustav Mendelssohn. The couple, now expecting their first child, represented the perfect union between tradition and progress, between love for the land and a vision for the future. "Anyone seeing all this activity today would hardly believe how it all began," commented Peter, helping to organize the photos for the exhibition that told the story of the project. Among the images, there was a special one, the photo of the wrecked car from that stormy night. "Every moment brought us here," replied Gustav, his hand instinctively reaching for Emily's. "Every choice, every person." The cultural center had been built while preserving elements of local architecture, but incorporating sustainable technologies. Solar panels powered the building, while a rainwater harvesting system kept the rooftop garden designed by Margaret alive. "It's like a little piece of heaven," said the matriarch, admiring the medicinal herbs and flowers she cultivated on the terrace. "A place where the past and the future meet." The inauguration ceremony brought together people from all over the country. Edward, now one of the leading advocates for sustainable projects in the business world, proudly presented the achievements of the New Village Institute. "This center is not just a building," he said in his speech. "It's a symbol of how we can transform the world when we unite different knowledge and experiences." Beatrice, elegant as always, but now with a simplicity she had learned to value, smiled as she watched her nephew and Emily guide visitors through the exhibition. Their story had become a case study in universities, an example of how love can be an agent of social transformation. "Look here," Emily explained to a group of students, "how traditional planting techniques, when combined with sustainable technology, can revolutionize food production." Anthony, who now coordinated the mentorship program for family farmers, added his wisdom to the technical explanations. "The land is generous," he said, "but we need to learn to respect it and work with it, not against it." In the late afternoon, as visitors began to leave, the family gathered in the center's garden. The sunset painted the sky with colors that seemed to celebrate every achievement, every special moment of that extraordinary journey. "Remember when you asked me if I regretted taking you in that night?" Anthony said to Gustav as they shared coffee on the porch. "How could I forget?" replied Gustav, smiling. "It was when you taught me that some seeds need a storm to germinate." Emily Thompson, caressing her belly, watched the scene with teary eyes. In a few months, a new life would join that family, which had grown in such unexpected and wonderful ways. "Our son will grow up knowing two stories," she said to Gustav. "The story of the father who lost his memory and found his true destiny, and the story of how love can transform the world." Margaret, always attentive to special moments, gathered everyone for a photo in front of the new center. "To capture another beginning," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Richard, who had become a close friend of the family, observed, "It's amazing how a story that began with a man lost in the rain ended up finding its way into so many hearts." The day was coming to an end, but the legacy of New Village was just beginning. The cultural center would be more than a museum or a learning space. It would be a beacon of hope, showing that it is possible to build a future where development and preservation go hand in hand. "You know what's most beautiful?" said Gustav, embracing Emily as they watched the first stars appear in the sky. "How destiny sometimes takes everything away from us, only to give us much more than we ever dreamed of." At the Oliver farm, where a love story had transformed an entire region, the cycle of life continued. Every new morning, more people arrived. Seeking to learn, more dreams were planted, more hopes blossomed. And so, between heaven and earth, between the past and the future, between simplicity and progress, a story that began with an accident on a stormy night continued to write its most beautiful chapters in the hearts of all those who believed in the transformative power of love. "Love is like a seed," philosophized Margaret in her simple wisdom. "Sometimes it needs a storm to sprout, but when it finds fertile ground, it never stops growing." And that night, under the starry sky of the countryside, the Oliver farm shone like a beacon of hope, reminding everyone that the greatest miracles happen when we open our hearts to the unexpected.